Greetings, colleagues and friends in the ISME Forum and Musicians Health and Wellness SIG. I'm sad not to be seeing all of you in person this summer, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity to connect virtually. My workshop on the topic of training the flexible-minded musician is the product of two major influences in my life over the past 10 years. The first is my personal struggle with musician's dystonia as a violinist and teacher. And the second is my training and work in the Feldenkrais method. As I have worked to understand more about my injury and its relationship to both playing and my own learning, I've been immensely grateful for the specific research into the neurological nature of musicians' injuries that has emerged in the last 15 years or so. Parallel to this has been my immersion into the pedagogical elements of the work of Moshe Feldenkrais. In my training and since, I gradually learned the hard way that I could not do many of the movement sequences in his lessons without triggering my own dystonic patterns. I was initially drawn to this method as a musician because it wasn't just about the mechanics or the movement, but it was actually about human learning. Because I was unable to do many of the movement sequences in the lessons, I began to turn my attention to studying the pedagogical construction of the work as a whole and applying that in lessons and in the classroom with students. As I began to experiment with these ideas in workshops and lessons and in clinics, and continued to read much of the current research, some parallel themes began to emerge between the work of Feldenkrais and the ideas I was starting to understand about musicians' injury. The big message that kept coming to me was that we all needed more flexibility of thinking and more adaptability in the way that we learn as musicians. So in this workshop, in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to explore some of the movement lessons of Moshe Feldenkrais in just very small samples, just to illustrate some of the pedagogy behind those lessons in ways that I think are useful in training musicians. We're going to look at some elements of the basic construction of the pedagogy in Feldenkrais's work. We're going to survey some of that current research into how musicians' injuries happen. And then I'm going to give you an array of samples for working with musicians at various stages of development, from beginner to working in the classroom in public schools to pre-professional and advanced musicians. I'm very eager for discussion and feedback, so at the end of this presentation, I'm going to provide you with my contact information, and I would just really love to hear from you. I hope you'll find something novel and useful for your own teaching and practice in this workshop. Thank you. I derived the title for this workshop from this famous quote from Moshe Feldenkrais, emphasizing the true philosophy behind his method of learning. Feldenkrais used movement and examination of function in order to enable personal evolution, change, and maturation. In this workshop, I would like to show how learning and skill acquisition in musicians can also be filled with opportunities to develop the kind of flexibility in thought and action that will promote safer, healthier playing over lifelong careers. Let's start with a short experiment. Take a moment to position yourself comfortably and close your eyes. Move away from your thoughts and turn your attention inward toward your sensation. Without analyzing, notice a part of yourself that immediately draws your focus. Concentrate on the feeling you experience there. Now begin to notice why your attention goes to this place. Is it a feeling of discomfort, or pleasure, or pressure, or contact with your clothing? Or maybe some small sense of movement that comes from your breath or a shift in your body. For a moment, allow your attention to drift to places that redirect your awareness. Perhaps some of these places have an emotional connection or are connected with recent use. Now see if you can bring your attention to your third toe on your left foot. Can you distinguish this toe from the other 4 toes? Try wiggling your toes and notice if the movement and contact with other toes begins to clarify your sense. Now touch each toe individually and feel the texture of your touch distinctly on the skin of each toe. As you bring your hand away, do you notice any additional clarity in identifying this often elusive third toe? Now open your eyes and take a look at the parts of the body pictured here. Which have the greatest familiarity in your movement and sensation? What are your thoughts as you imagine each in connection to your own body? Do you find that you also have strong judgments and emotions that are particular to some of these? As you may know, the idea of the homunculus or little man was first referenced by Wilder Penfield in the 1940s when he used electrodes to map the regions of the sensory and motor cortices in the brain that pertained to distinct parts of the body. These cortical maps evolve over the course of our lifetime in response to both the movement and sensory information we provide from personal experience. Places where we use ourselves frequently have large representation, whereas places where we rarely attend remain small. This means that our perception of ourselves, or our internal map, is dependent on the kind of experiential learning we provide. Now close your eyes again, and this time try to remove your focus from sensation and instead begin to imagine your shape and form as a whole. Imagine drawing yourself as a fluid stick figure made up of 5 lines. 1 line for your spine, 1 line for each of your arms, 1 line for each of your legs. What is your perception of the length and points of contact, if any, for these lines? Imagine the line of your spine as continuous from the crown of your head to the tip of your tailbone. Can you trace this line without allowing it to fade or break? Now imagine the lines of each of your legs from hip joint to heel. Are these 2 lines the same length? How do their shapes differ depending on how you are sitting? Can you sense the points where they might feel connected to the line of the spine in this simplest of representations? And what about the lines of each of your arms? How do they differ in shape and length? How do they compare to the lines of your legs? Make a few movements of lifting and lowering your arms and see if you can maintain the image of all 5 lines at the same time. How do each of the lines change in reaction to this small stimulus from your arms? This idea of the 5 lines is used in a series of lessons that Feldenkrais created called the primary image. It is a primary image in that it corresponds to our earliest representations of ourselves in the sensory and motor cortices as infants. Feldenkrais described the representation of the 1-month-old infant as 5 lines plus lips and a tongue. When children first start to represent themselves in drawing, they also each begin with images of 5 lines. Artists often use these basic representations of movement and form to illustrate something about the whole body in space. In a Suzuki violin camp for 6 to 12-year-olds this past summer, I did an expanded version of this lesson, asking students to draw their versions of the 5 lines after a series of movements in different positions. Take a look at these examples. I learned from this that even the youngest children in the group were able to clearly represent themselves in this format and give valuable insight into their self-perception. So let's turn our attention to what happens as we accumulate sensory and motor learning as musicians and how it changes the way we perceive and begin to use ourselves over time. First, we will look at a typical timeline for learning and then explore how certain kinds of narrowing of focus lead to patterns of inflexibility, difficulty with change and adaptability, and generally lead to systemic imbalances that can create difficulty and even dysfunction. Training of young children often includes games and experiments, but as we advance towards greater proficiency, we tend to gravitate towards schools of technique and even dogmatic prescriptions for playing. As we scrutinize our weaknesses and begin to over-identify with our strengths, performance anxiety arises. As we begin to fear mistakes in performance, and even our livelihood becomes dependent on our accuracy and perfectionist standards, we hold fast to these strengths and obsess about the weaknesses even further. It becomes difficult to try new ways of playing and approaching problems because change involves risk. As we age, then even our strengths become so stereotyped that we find it difficult to conceive of doing things in new ways at all. In working with professional and pre-professional musicians around performance challenges and injury, and I include working with my own injury here, I have noticed a few relevant characteristics that many experienced musicians share. Among them are, first, strongly held concepts of correctness, even when they experience success or reduce pain in doing something opposed to those concepts. Second, their habitual ways of approaching their instrument are deeply rooted in emotional relationships to playing, including feelings of loyalty to teachers or great artists who may have inspired them. Third, they often experience injury or difficulty at a point when they are forced into a change of environment or circumstance, but they lack the training in variation and adaptability to evolve with the new conditions. And fourth, performance demands almost always lead to a regression towards old habitual patterns, and very often injury recurrence. Some of the delay in addressing musicians' long-term health from a pedagogical perspective has been due to the long-held assumptions about the purely orthopedic and mechanical nature of musicians' injuries. Much current treatment still looks to studies of the late 20th century, which compare musicians to athletes, make localized modifications, and treat these injuries with drugs, stretching, and other modalities alone. In the last 15 years or so, particularly due to the advent of fMRI and specific researchers who have begun to explore what makes musicians' injuries distinct, we have access to important information about the changes in the brain that occur as a direct result of how we learn and reinforce skill through long-term practice. These researchers, like our own Eckhard Altenmüller and his team in Hanover, Germany, have uncovered key neurological features of musicians' injury that suggest a critical need for addressing how we teach our students music. 4 of these ideas that are relevant to teaching students to become more adaptable and flexible in their continued learning are, first, that when we study an instrument, we begin to create a vast network of connections to each action that we take that goes far beyond the scope of almost any other learning in sports or other activities. Second, these changes, when subject to repeated intense activity within a narrowing range of specificity over a long period of time, can begin to compromise our ability to self-regulate. This is in part because of the strong connection of self-regulatory mechanisms and the limbic system. There is evidence to suggest, for example, that we begin to derive pleasure from the kind of repetitive practice that contributes to our overdevelopment. Lastly, when our self-regulation becomes compromised, it is very easy for our learning in these very focused ways, using limited parts of the body and the peripheral nervous system, to become out of balance with the whole system, leading to problems with inhibitory control and other neurological issues present with musicians' injury and dysfunction. So I'd like to turn now to some of the ideas behind Feldenkrais's work that I think are especially useful to reimagining our approach to teaching musicians. I love this photo of the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion doing a headstand on the beach at the age of 71. Ben-Gurion came to Feldenkrais after suffering from years of back pain in the midst of his difficult tenure as prime minister. Feldenkrais suggested that if Ben-Gurion could learn to stand on his head, in the process, he would gain the flexibility in his thinking that would help him become a more effective leader. After working with Feldenkrais on this feat for 6 months, Ben-Gurion not only gained relief from his back pain, but is rumored to have said, "I have to stand on my head so that the state of Israel can stand on its feet." At the very beginning of his career, Feldenkrais gained a prestigious position in the survey office in Israel, making some of the first maps of Palestine for the British government. Feldenkrais used his background in calculus and Gaussian geometry to do the impossible task of mapping contoured terrain into flat surfaces in order to approximate land values. This task involved making increasingly fine approximations and distinctions to serve a variety of situations without ever settling on a single solution. This theme of approximating, varying focus, and revising is an integral part of Feldenkrais's approach to teaching people how to learn without fixing on singular solutions. In order not to become easily fixed in our approach, Feldenkrais felt that it was critical that we maintain our inner compass for learning that is so much more prominent in children than in adults. To do this, our learning must retain its experiential and even playful nature, even as we begin to experience necessary socialization and degrees of conformity. One of the main ways Feldenkrais does this in his lessons is by creating conditions for learning rather than dictating what to do. He sets up puzzles and obstacle courses that allow us to experience distinctions and variations of function within ourselves that we would not access through the more limited point of view of a teacher's own experience. His lessons allow students to break down and observe the functions of the body and nervous system and reconstruct them to suit new actions and new circumstances. Feldenkrais's conception of awareness also acknowledges the vast brain networking that is tied together in all human action. In order to free ourselves from unhelpful and even harmful patterns of habit, we need to recognize the intertwining of thought, sensation, movement, and emotion in all of our learning. To accomplish this, Feldenkrais sets up conditions that also allow us to recognize underused and underexplored parts of ourselves. We begin to see how spreading our awareness can not only improve action and skill, but it also helps us maintain a critical balance as we learn higher level skills over longer periods of time. These protect us from overuse injuries. Now let's move on to the more practical side of things. In this section, I would like to share with you an array of examples of ways I have found to incorporate these pedagogical principles into teaching musicians. I'll start with working with beginners and the idea of fostering autonomy in this learning process, even as we begin establishing the foundations of specific skills. Just to get you in the mind frame of a beginner learning new skills, let's add another experiment. Close your eyes and begin to imagine a clock in front of your face. This clock has a minute hand but no hour hand. Begin to use your nose to push the hand around the clock in a clockwise direction. Go slowly and make sure you move smoothly to pass each of the numbers on the clock face. Move clockwise around the clock a couple of times. Once you begin to feel comfortable with this movement, imagine a paintbrush in your left hand with a self-generating supply of paint. As you continue to push the minute hand around the clock, begin to paint some horizontal stripes around the left half of your head. Begin with the left half of your chin and make the stripe go all the way around to the middle of the back of your head. Then return to the front of your face and paint a parallel stripe just above the lowest one. Are you still moving clockwise around your clock? How easy is it to shift your attention from your nose and the clock to your left hand and your painting? Continue this until you have completed parallel stripes covering the whole left half of your head. As you do this, can you gradually spread your attention to incorporate both movements? And notice how easy is it for your attention to get stuck in one place. Feel free to pause the recording and play with this as you like. At the apprenticeship level of learning music, there are so many complex skills that are brand new and which require tremendous coordination. One of the tools I find most helpful in preparing students to learn to sense themselves through these complexities is to continuously reinforce developmental learning to build strong connections between the hemispheres of the brain. These include working with balance, crossing the midline, and working with variations of contralateral and ipsilateral movements. Here you can see the Suzuki violin students engaged in an animal walk relay. Another strategy that I find important at every level is working with proprioception so that students learn to sense their bodies as a whole in different environments. An activity like this partner rolling could influence how a student positions herself in front of a music stand or later shares a stand space with a partner in an orchestra while maintaining a personal sense of comfort. From the very beginning, I also like to give students both visual and tactile information about the specifics of function in the body and nervous system. Learning features of our skeletal structure or constructing a mechanical hand to understand how the flexors and extensors of our fingers work gives students extra tools to enable personal problem solving as they play. As younger students gain some experience with playing, I like to encourage changes in perspective and perception This includes changing the focus of the eyes and ears, and even varying the orientation of the music stand. Lastly, even when it comes to reading and musicianship development, I've found that it's possible to set up conditions for self-learning. Here are the measures of a Brahms waltz cut into puzzle pieces for students to read, play, and audiate to reconstruct the whole from memory. This is even a great exercise to do with simple, unfamiliar pieces to hear the kinds of harmonic sequences that make music fit together and make sense. A portion of my current work involves helping string educators to understand musicians' injury and to introduce strategies for creating experiments that students can do even in a classroom setting to individualize the learning experience. Some of my favorite experiments involve simple reversals of various functions of playing. Set up an imaginary playing position as though you are miming playing your instrument. Try to attend to as many details as you can, like the position of your head, arms, pelvis, legs, and even where your eyes might typically look. Now choose one feature in your playing to reverse in its setup. For example, if your head faces slightly to the left, you could look right. Or if you pronate one or both arms, you might bring them into supination. If your eyes look up and out into the room, you might look down or even to the side. Now choose a different feature to reverse. Perhaps if your arms are in flexion most of the time, you could extend them away from you. If you are a singer, you might change a feature in your palate or even in your breathing. Now take these two features of function and slowly change each from your normal playing configuration to your version of its reversal. Do these together and then in opposition to each other. For example, as a violinist with a tight jaw, I might open my mouth and pronate my left arm with smooth, continuous timing. See if you can attend to the features of both functional movements at the same time. I actually once taught myself to play the opening of the Beethoven Violin Concerto with my head turning side to side in opposition to the movement of my bow. You can tailor this exercise to various situations to help students discover what is habitual to playing and begin to distinguish between movements and postures that are functional to playing and ones that are either extraneous or used in excess. In the classroom, I like to give students movement puzzles to work out in their own bodies that relate to the more complex actions of playing. In this case, students are exploring the functions involved in tracking a straight bow on the string between the bridge and the fingerboard. Move your arm in the range that it moves parallel to the floor, and tell me, what shape are you drawing?
A line. A straight line.
Is it a line?
Yes.
It's a semicircle, right? What's the name of the joint? The circle that you are on the outside of. How do you do that? Yes, there you go. Yes. Another way to access teaching points in an experiential way is to vary the perspective. Here, students are practicing a more complex bow stroke against a wall to discover what parts of themselves must be free to move in order to both move quickly and precisely to achieve the necessary articulation. See what has to move. Did you have to move anything in your hand and your fingers? And then scoot yourself a little bit closer to the wall so that your elbow, when you're in the middle of the bow in particular, can you feel in the middle of the bow your elbow is probably the most bent? Where does it unbend the most, obviously?
When it's down at the tip.
When it's down at the tip. And what happens when you get closer to where the frog would be on the string?
You bend it, and then if you go so far, it kind of doesn't get back.
Jug it, jug it. Wait, let yourself travel. Jug it, jug it, jug it, jug it, jug it, jug it. And experiment with the other one. Up, 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 up. How do you do that and stay relaxed in your shoulder?
Flexible, because otherwise it's just like a single bow stroke, because like the wrist is not moving, so it's not causing this.
1, 2, ready, go. The music classroom is also a place where it is very easy to get into the habit of drilling repetitive patterns. This can happen in warm-ups and in addressing problem spots in a piece. A simple solution is to vary the order and organization of these patterns. If you always start scales from the bottom and go up, start at the top or even the middle, or play the same notes in each octave, or leave out notes of your choosing. You can also go one step further and have students create the pattern variations themselves. Make sure no one is cheating when you ask the other students to use their ears to figure out how to replicate the pattern. Listen and figure out how she does it. Ready? Two, three. 2, 3, 1, 4, right? Who can tell me what those notes were? Oh, yes, ma'am. Exactly. Got it? Okay. Good. Step onto a strong 4 and get your 3 close. Beautiful. Another great set of tools in the classroom are props that help students continue to work on balance and proprioception while experimenting with new skills. As young violinists are challenged with finding new locations on the fingerboard, they often tilt their heads for a better view of the instrument. Beanbags are among my favorite props. Good. All first finger. Finally, I find that it is important, especially in larger groups, to keep students moving and multitasking so that they don't become so fixated on just the visible features of their playing and learning. In this case, the left hand, the instrument, and the bow. In this final section, I'll share some of my ideas for working with advanced students and pre-professionals. If I had to name one teaching concept that I feel is most important at this stage, it would be dispelling students of fixed ideas about correctness in their playing. As these students advance into their careers, we want them to embrace change and have strategies to make adjustments for new encounters over long and enjoyable careers. For our last experiment, turn your attention to your breathing. When you start to pay attention, do you also change your breath? Ask yourself, did you change it because of notions of correctness about how to breathe? Did you make a judgment about shallowness or the movement of your diaphragm? Now imagine you had to move a heavy object, let's say pushing a piano across a stage, since most of us have done that. How would you exhale to utilize the power and strength in your whole body? Imagine doing this, for example, while drawing in your abdomen in a yogic exhalation. If you did this, you could strain or injure yourself. Now imagine yourself preparing to sleep and allowing your body to relax. Notice how different your breath becomes in comparison to the action of moving the piano. Allow yourself to become aware of your breathing in a variety of situations, from swimming to distance running to playing your instrument to laughing and goofing around with friends. Observe any judgments or conscious changes you might tend to make before allowing yourself to discover from inside how adaptable this most elemental of human functions can be. In a related experiment with advanced string players, I have them look at photos of professional bow holds and judge their reactions. Many find that their preferences for schools of technique create strong aversions to ways of playing that are unfamiliar to them. Among the first challenges I give to newer students is to have them experiment with ways of playing that they consider incorrect. We do this to broaden the range of what actually can work in different situations and to fully experience ways of playing that are only judged incorrect in thought. I also use the concept of incorrect playing, like playing way too far over the fingerboard, to help students discover new solutions to old problems, like how they might use the muscles of their back to more successfully pull the bow closer to the bridge. Oh, that's pretty good. Now bring it 2 inches up. And friction from your back. Good. More advanced students are much more prone to seeing solutions to their problems in a localized way. This particular student struggled with generating a beautiful sound and was convinced by a masterclass clinician that the problem was in her bow hand. Exploring the balance and support of her instrument through the folding and unfolding in her ribs changed her whole approach to the instrument, and her bow hand issues disappeared. Working with the whole body in relation to seemingly localized issues makes the biggest difference when we can draw students' attention to sensory cues, as in this example. Exaggerate that. There you go. Yeah. Try it one time tilting your head and then one time not tilting your head. Now try looking up at the arm that's going up. That's another way to do it. Do that on the other side. See how you go downhill? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then to go to the right foot, you kind of come back up. And so you have this sort of diagonal motion. If the violin were to go up on one side and down on the other side, which side would it go up on?
It goes up on the left.
Yes, exactly. And it goes, and now do what you know is the kind of typical pattern that you have. So the going down when you go left and up when you feel the strain on the right side of your neck even? Yeah. You feel how you have to reach to get there? Good. And now shift your weight left and right, but keep your head in the center. And notice that doesn't disrupt the path of the bow. Do you feel it? Because these students are often experiencing the pressures of auditions and more frequent high-stakes performance, I also find that changing orientation and environment to help them recognize new ways to adapt is an important part of this training. This example might be a little bit extreme, but it needs to remain fun, experimental, and engaging with these students as much as it does with the little ones. Finally, you can just never add enough in the way of developmental challenges and games at any age. Remember Ben-Gurion standing on his head at 71. We need to keep finding new challenges that help us broaden our perspective and make our brains as malleable as they can be. Can you tap your fingers on one hand, index to pinky, while doing the reverse on the other hand? Good. Can you do one hand the opposite? So 1, 2, 3, 4 with one hand and 4, 3, 2, 1 on the other one?
Okay.
Good. Thank you for joining me for this workshop. I hope you all are remaining safe and healthy, and that we will be able to connect in person soon. Until then, please visit my website at www.lisaburellviolin.com and email me at rilkesq@yahoo.com. I am eager to hear from you.